All right, last bit of background for this book. We have the roles of men and women, which we've looked at in every book so far. And you might ask, well, why do we keep talking about this? What does it matter? What about the roles of men and women? Well, here's a question. If you were to say, what are the roles of men and women in society today? What would they be? What is the difference? Is there a difference? And particularly during this time period where people are questioning gender identity and they're thinking, well, men and women are equal, men and women have the same responsibilities. That has not been historically the case that people would make that argument. And so um, it's important because it preserves historical and regional tendencies for defining those sorts of questions that scholars will then live on to debate. So whether that matters to you or not, it's going to be important in sort of a historical context to map and chart what has been expected from men and from women, um, how we've sort of defined those um, responsibilities, rights, privileges, thoughts, that sort of thing. And so in this book, there are different roles than there were in To Kill a Mockingbird. There are different roles than there were in Huckleberry Finn or in Julius Caesar. So, because the country was considered to be too dangerous and rugged for women, the first people to travel west were only men. And it wasn't until the mid 1800s when families moved west, again, women not by themselves, but men with their families. In the 19th century, women's roles were clearly differentiated from men's. They were responsible to take care of the home, the family, and kind of work on responsibilities at church. Otherwise, everything else was sort of the man's role. Her role was to civilize the family and the community by exhibiting virtues like gentleness, purity, and chastity. Women were to be sheltered from physical labor and the harsh world of business and finance. Some people, scholars today, have called this the cult of true womanhood. They are quick to point out that these restrictive ideals had little to do with how real women lived their lives, but and they excluded the working class women. So, for instance, it was still, even in these harsh environments, a privilege for women to be able to just stay home and do these things. When you were a slave or a working class woman, you worked extremely long, harsh, hard hours doing very physical labor. And so even this cult of true womanhood was a byproduct of basically privilege and economic status. Most of the ideas about women's roles originated in the wealthier, more populous East, but many women who moved west carried these ideals with them, and they thought that it was their duty to civilize the frontier. And once they founded a homestead, they were likely to find themselves working alongside their husbands and sharing the burden of homesteading more or less equally because it necessitated or required that. So these tensions are going to be found throughout my Antonia. You're going to see Antonia working like a man. She's plowing, harvesting. She belongs to a man's sphere, even though she's a woman. And she's oftentimes competing with and superseding her role and kind of the actions and responsibilities and tasks that the men had in that society. And we've already kind of talked about this, so I won't harp on it further, which is the women's suffrage movement. And obviously, man's work is equally derogatory in a sense because it assumes all he's good for is labor, that he's not good for educating, that he's not good for civilizing or providing manners or moral guidance or religious upbringing or education, and that he's kind of a brute that is only there for his muscular ability and his physical prowess. So, for instance, there's one of the brothers in the Smyrna family, and he is not bright at all, but he's one of the most valuable members of the family because he is literally like strong like an ox or like a horse. And so he was valued in that society not for who he was, but for what he could do. And so I would say that that tendency toward just not valuing the person, but valuing what they have to offer or gift, and then also the prejudice and stereotyping was equally relevant to the men and the women at that time. Um, Something that we're going to see in this book and in other literature is this concept of regionalism. So it's one region of the country against another region of the country. Today, we still kind of do this like, oh, the South. In the South, they X, Y, or Z. Or, oh, you're from the West Coast. Oh, you're from California. You guys are laid back. You're materialistic. It's sort of an anything goes culture. Whereas, like in the Northwest, people say, like, oh, they're crunchy. They all like to be outside, and nature is really important to them. And they tend to homeschool their children and um, do nature school. And then on the East Coast, if you're in New York, it's about, um, I mean, on and on and on and on. So we do still have regionalism in our day-to-day conversations and expectations, but it's going to come out here because they're going to pit certain regions of the country against others. And what this does is it tends to reinforce um, particular expectations of the emotions, the experiences, the flavors, I guess you will, of particular areas of the United States. That helps us to understand kind of what it was like because it's obviously not the same today. Um, Other things going on during this time in the mid 19th century was the movement called Transcendentalism. It was a belief in spiritual or transcendent truths, which kind of went beyond what we could perceive in our material existence. So, for example, they weren't Christian transcendentalists in the sense that they thought about God and the Holy Spirit, but it was sort of like nature has power and um, we can commune with it. And there's this energy. It's where you get a lot of like the spiritualists today will look back at the transcendentalist movement and think like, wow, they started something amazing. And so I think there was the tendency to believe that nature was governed by some sort of a power because it really was something that was a force to be reckoned with that killed many people. And so ancient civilizations and ancient cultures that knew a little bit less about science would tend to say that nature was a true energy or that there was something going on behind the scenes that had nothing to do with what we could see. And that's transcendentalism. So you'll hear of authors like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, who basically assumed that there were there was a necessity for humans to become self-reliant, to self-express, towards self-realization in order to become transcendent or above. I don't need material things because when I inevitably lose those material things, it's going to hurt me in the end. And they kind of realized that um, if you're above materialism, if you're above pain or whatever that might be, that it won't um, conquer you. In other words, so the Transcendentalist movement is associated with the mid 19th century. There were a lot of writers that wrote during this time, and they used a lot of nature in realism. Realism is an attempt to take art and capture what it is that you're seeing. So I talked about this before, to take the senses, so sight and sound and smell, and try to put them into painting or try to put them into words for literature that would preserve it as accurately as possible so that you could have like a truly realistic portrayal of what was going on in that novel. So there was a tension between realism and transcendentalism because if you think about it, realism is trying to preserve the world as we see it, and transcendentalism is trying to rise above it. And there's that tension in this novel because we're going to see that it's this very real, descriptive, painful, slogging, materialistic book. And yet at the same time, each of the characters think to something greater to get over the emotional impact of what they were having to live in their lives. And so you're going to see the contrast between the two of them. Also, when you're writing this during World War One, it is sort of this like flashback or harrowing for there's got to be something more than just this life. There has to be something more than just death and carnage and like what is the value of life, and all of those things are going to be explored in this novel. So As you continue, there are character lists if you're interested in each of the characters if you get lost. It's pretty easy. I read the book in an afternoon, um, and we are going to break it down into different sections. But I wanted to show you a couple of images. So this is what a train station would have looked like in that area. So you also have a sod house. So this is where somebody would have lived. Their home was inside of here, kind of underground. And obviously you can see like this whole family lives there with the horses. Um, this would have been um, a home like you would have aspired to. If you made it, you could build a farmhouse. And but you had to bring trees in and hand water them because there wasn't any water. So all of these trees, all of the landscape had to be nurtured bit by the settlers. This could have been this was her childhood home, kind of the town where she lived, and it's what it would have looked like. Um, And again, millions of acres. Here's the view of the big blue. And it basically the rolling prairie of Nebraska for sale on 10 years credit. You could buy land in Burlington and Missouri River Railroad Company at 6% interest and low prices. You could have tickets for land exploring. Um, and so this would kind of entice people to go settle the territory. So those were a couple of things to look at. And then this is her epitaph, so kind of who she's writing the book for. It's in memory of affections old and true. So it plays along with that theme of memories. What role do memories play in the people in our lives? So one final presentation I wanted to look at to kind of help us kind of get a better handle on it from a different perspective. The style is simple. It's minimal, it's short, but it has descriptive sentences. Nothing is overly complicated, so this isn't going to be like your dense piece of literature. It's actually very readable. Love and emotion is kind of left out. As readers, we have to fill in these emotions ourselves. So one student put it this way, that in the book, the structure and the point of view and the very descriptive language of the landscape portrayed the truth that was at the core of this age by representing it with a realistic, atypical love story that fails to resolve. So it is sort of a romance, but it never resolves. It's kind of, there's a broken heart, but yet at the same time, it's mended, but it doesn't ever really resolve. So it plays with those themes that it's an unusual style for the time. Here's the characters Jim and Antonia. He is a successful lawyer in New York. He's the protagonist, he's a narrator, he's in love with Antonia for most of his life, but he doesn't confess it until the end of the story. She is an immigrant. She's a very strong, individualistic person, and they live out an adventurous childhood in the prairies of Nebraska. The structure of the story has a couple of anecdotes and experiences over his entire lifetime. It's fast forwards during 20 years at one point. And so is there a climax? Perhaps, perhaps not. So there's the opening, there's a bit of a conflict, the rising action, and then the falling action and resolution. So it follows a basic plot diagram that you would see in a novel. It focuses on memories. Memories are the vehicle for the story. It gives a real sense of what it was like for the early pioneers settling west. It's not romanticized. And if you were to write a story just based on memories, what would it look like? In the end, Jim has to accept that Antonia is a part of his past and he has to find peace with it. He doesn't fit the mold of your typical individual at this time, neither does she. It's told from a memoir point of view, so looking back. Jem is said to be another version of Willa Cather herself, and they share many of the same experiences. So its purpose is to understand Antonia, but at the same time give us a glimpse into him and his own development. So it's coming of age for both of them. It plays upon this concept of nature, landscape, distance, and it has been very well